Well, hello. Welcome to Kokoro Conversations. We are so glad you're joining us today. I'm Rebekah Anderson.
I'm Alex Lang.
And today we're going to be talking with you about traditionalism. We're excited to have this series because essentially the reason why we decided to do this was over the summer we filmed those episodes of the Kokoro series. And afterwards, as we were cleaning up all of our stuff, we get to kind of debrief some of the topics that we went through and get into a little bit more depth of why those things were important and some of the personal experiences we had. And so it's our hope that by talking about this, we'll be able to have some interesting conversations. That's such a meaningful part of life, but also really encourage you to get more intentional about how you live. So
I think that's a good explanation.
okay, good. Well, should we jump in then?
Let's jump in.
So one of the things that you and I have talked about is the fact that in America and the world more broadly, we tend to kind of swing back and forth between kind of leaning more liberal, more progressive in our thinking, and then eventually something happens and we swing back toward traditionalism. So I just want to ask, what do you think about that? Why do you think that happens?
Yeah, so I think probably the best way to start is with some research that was done by a Harvard professor, Robert Putnam, who wrote, his most famous book was Bowling Alone, which was talking about the coming epidemic of loneliness that we've already discussed. And he was talking about that back in the early 2000s. So he was already seeing that. And the whole premise of the book was that he was seeing that more and more people were bowling, which is normally a communal sport, by themselves. And so he thought that was a harbinger of things to come. And he was correct. He was right on with that. So he wrote a book more recently called The Upswing. And he was talking about this idea of how American society, it swings back and forth between communalism and individualism. And he gives some really interesting points along the way in American history where you can see that happen. So he talked about how communalism was huge in the 1830s when Alexis de Tocqueville comes to the United States, and he's kind of going around and seeing this brand new nation and trying to figure out what makes it special, because people in Europe are really talking about it. Oh, there's this new nation. They made it through, all the wars. So now he wants to see what it's all about. And he was really impressed by how fiercely people really guarded their individual freedoms, the things that they cared about. But at the same time, they were willing to sacrifice for their community. And that led him to write Democracy in America, which of course was this huge bestseller. And it was a big reason why people started immigrating to the United States in the way that they did, because they could see how special it was. Then he fast forward to the 1890s. So it's kind of like you go through the Civil War, 1890s. Now we're at the Gilded Age, the peak of individualism, very much survival of the fittest. And he talks about how at that point in time, if you look at it compared to today, it was actually more politically divided than it is today, which is hard to believe that was the case, but that's essentially what you could see at that time. And then we get World War I, and that of course swings us back towards the communalism, because if you're going to win a war, you kind of got to work together, right? So if you're not going to do that, and then we have the Great Depression, got to work together. World War II, got to work together, and communalism kind of hits its peak in the 1960s, and then the pendulum starts to swing back towards individualism, and we've kind of seen the peak of individualism really hit in the last 2 decades, probably the peak being closer to 2020, where we've hit that ultimate point where now it's going to start to swing back. And the idea of individualism, the idea that the individual is what matters most, is something that has really been pervasive in our society. I'm sure you would agree with that, yes?
Sure.
So I think that now that has unfortunately wrought a lot of negative consequences. And one of those consequences is what we talked about in the previous episode, which is literally loneliness. And so now I think people have this yearning, this longing for community again. And when they are looking for that, usually when you have a yearning or a longing for something, it's nostalgia, right? It's looking back. And so I think people are starting to look back and say, what was it like when people had community? What was it like when they were when they felt together? And I think that ultimately comes from a previous time when there was a more traditional type society. So I look at his work and I see that it's a natural flow back and forth in the pendulum. So I think we are at a time where that's just naturally happening. But I'm interested to know your perspective on it. What do you aside from research and scholarship and all those things, what's your perspective on why you think that this is occurring right now?
Wow. I love everything you shared just because it helps me to contextualize some of just the actual lived experience of it, which I'm noticing a couple things. It's like there's a conflict usually that gives people a shared sense of identity, and it supersedes like whether your sense is that you're somebody who's more open-minded or whether you're traditional values. We've got to hold close to the things that matter to us. More of almost a black and white sort of thing about this is right, this is wrong. And so that kind of allows people to rise above it. And then when that's no longer there, people kind of have to look around and say, well, who were we separate from this? I mean, going back to the Puritans coming over, it was, we have to get back to the way that things were. Right. Back when we were more righteous, back when we really cared about what was important. Yeah. And so there was a sense that undergirded every single group in history in some different way. Mm-hmm. There was a sense of, we've lost the way. Mm-hmm. We've lost what was most important, and we have to get back. But I think every person has experienced this in some way. Our memory of how things were and how they actually were is very different. And that was true historically, but now we have things like television shows and marketing campaigns that really get people feeling a certain way about how things were in the past. Yeah. I think my generation is extremely nostalgic. The number of people on my For You page that are like, they have entire video series just dedicated to like, this is what life was like in the early 2000s. If you played a sport, you wore pre-wrap, you lifted up the sleeves of your shirt on your jersey, like this is how we dressed, this is how we looked. And it makes you really want to go back to that place, even if it wasn't actually a very good place. But another big part of that, when people are saying we have to get back to the way that things were, usually an important part of that is figuring out, well, who do we have to blame for us getting wrong? And so getting off on the wrong path.
Yeah. So things right now are not working.
Yes.
In your, like, I think when you're going back towards something something right now is not functioning the way you think it should be. Yeah. And so if you don't have an answer to, we need to fix X thing, it's that we've gotten away from the core of who we were. And if we got back to that core, then things would be better. Everything
would be right. And everything would be right, especially if the people who we think are responsible for everything going wrong, if they get back, if we put them in their place and let them know this is not how it's supposed to be. I've heard this phrase, common enemy intimacy, where like the most potent kind of source of your connection is that you hate the same people. And eventually that really falls apart. I mean, if I have a friendship with somebody based on the fact that we both hate somebody, like, and that's it, it falls apart. But imagine that on like a global scale. It's not a very strong point of connection.
So I think traditionalism, if we were to define that, because I think that's in order to really dive into it in a way that I think is going to be useful, we have to define what does it mean to be traditional. And I think different people might have different definitions. My sense of it is not necessarily one monolithic thing, but it's to each individual person, there are traditions in their lives or from their culture or from their, line going back that they hearken back to, and they say, this particular tradition that we used to invest in is something that should be important to us. And somewhere along the way, we let go of that and we need to grab on to that again so that we can reclaim our identity in a way that we haven't before. And I think that this is a really important point, which is that traditionalism and identity are very closely linked together. And usually, I think it's when a person lacks a sense of identity, they're losing a sense of identity, that oftentimes they're going to grasp on to the nostalgic kinds of traditionalism that have been lost. So what that says to me is that if we're heading back into a time of traditionalism, in mass, essentially, throughout society, here and across the world, that people are feeling a really deep sense of identity loss, that they're not linked into any particular sense of who they are. They don't have a deep sense of that. So as a result, they're now searching, they're kind of pawing in the darkness for something that they are. So I don't know if you would agree with that, but I think that's kind of, if we're going to get down to the core, for me, that's part of the core. What do you think is at the core of traditionalism?
Absolutely. I think you nailed it. I mean, the core of traditionalism is let's get back to something, a way of life that is at the core of who we are, at least how we think we were. Yeah. And so what I'm really struck by in what you said, though, is this is core to my identity. This is at the center of how I feel I need to live my life. This is values driven. And I think it's important to note that, because when something is that central to someone's identity, if it's that close to them, that means that anything around it is going to be extremely sensitive. So if you tell me I should not live this way, well, you are coming for my identity. You're coming for who I am as a person, and that is going to elicit very strong emotions from anybody.
Absolutely.
So with kind of what we're talking about, this swing between swing back to traditionalism, there are a lot of gender expectations kind of laden on that big swing. So I'm wondering, like, for men, now, what is the expectation placed on you in something like work?
I do think that there is an expectation still to this day to be a provider. That's very important. I also think that today it's different than it was in the past, in the sense that if you have children, you're expected to be a very involved father. And I think in the past, men could get away with being detached. And I mean, I know for me, my father never really spent time playing with me. That was never something. It was, if I was going to play, I was off on my own. My sons expected me to play with them. Right. And even my younger son to this day, he will often choose, if I'm going to do something with him, he wants to do it with me as opposed to his friend. So if he has a choice, he likes to wrestle, he likes to constantly kind of be with me. And I love that that's a part of it, right? That I think that's a wonderful thing. However, when you're working full time and you're trying to manage everything, particularly if you have a really big job, it can feel overwhelming. But I do think that for younger men today, and I want to go back to how young men are dealing with this.
Yes.
Because I'm 45, so I came up at a very different time than where people are today.
Yeah.
I think that a lot of men, at least from what I'm seeing, they feel very lost in the world that they're in. And that is primarily because when they look online, they have a lot more different things to look at. So they're looking at men being a certain way via social media.
Right.
Whereas the things that I saw when I was growing up to be a man, and I joke about this often, I grew up in the 80s with, the ultimate men were Arnold Schwarzenegger and Sylvester Stallone and Jean-Claude Van Damme. These were men because they were big and strong and muscular. Yeah.
You weren't in the John Wayne generation,
right.
Like the lonesome cowboy who was just forging off on his own. You were in the jacked and sort of that independent, I'm going to do it my own way and I'm going to do it myself. I don't need any help and I'm tough and strong so I can handle anything. I grew up doing ballet with blonde hair, blue eyes, in a pink leotard or whatever. So yes, I had that feminine part of me and I liked princesses, I liked girly things, but I also really didn't want people to see that as who I was. I also liked climbing trees, playing outside. Mm-hmm. My Batman toys were I liked them better than my Barbies. So
the concept of individuality that was really prevalent in our culture for the last 60 years or so.
Yeah.
That you benefited from that in the sense that you were not pigeonholed into a single area, that you could do a lot of different things with it.
Yeah.
And so I guess the question then becomes, that's how you grew up. That's good. That with traditionalism though, that's part of traditionalism, is that you are pigeonholed into various ways of being. That's part of the traditional mentality. That's why people like traditionalism, because it's very black and white. There's not fluidity to it. Yeah. In fact, the exact opposite. I know exactly who you are. I can see it from the beginning. Those traditional values allow me to identify very easily whether you're in or you're out. You're part of my tribe, you're not. So
I think I'm really understanding what you're saying here, and having that freedom felt so great, because it was like I could see what the traditional, even growing up the way I did, I could see what traditional expectations were of, you're a girl, this is what you're supposed to do. You're a boy, this is what you're supposed to do. I felt totally comfortable and totally at peace forging a different way for myself that was just the right amount of who I felt I was as a person on the inside. And sometimes I did feel the cultural pressure to go one way or another, but I had enough people modeling for me a unique way of moving through those expectations that I felt like I could. I think what I see now is I've created a whole life for myself that would maybe not have been possible as recently as 1975, when women couldn't have their own credit card. I'm not married and I'm in my late 20s. And so if I didn't have my own bank account, like that is my own, what would I do? I mean, I wouldn't be able to have my own place to live. I wouldn't be able to drive my own car. Like, I have all of these things, and my life I've been able to create is one of independence, which has been so good for me. So the thought that that's not possible is scary.
Well, yeah, and I think this is the interesting thing though. So for you, you've benefited from that.
Yeah.
But I think that what's happening with a lot of, and I don't know about women, you can speak to this, but I can say for a lot of young men, that fluidity has actually left them unmoored to a degree. And I think that's why certain men are drawn towards, I mean, we were talking earlier about the idea of what you see in the media defines your understanding of a man, right? Or what a man is supposed to be. And I think that the idea that you can be whatever you want, it's the reason why younger men today are drawn towards a very misogynistic figure like Andrew Tate, who is just awful. You hear the things that he says, the way that he talks about women, the way that he treats women, he's very abusive. But if you get into, and I've seen these within the algorithm, where if you're somebody who is maybe searching for an identity, so the fluidity that we've been kind of talking about, you don't quite know who you are.
Yeah. And
you get attracted to these very strong figures like an Andrew Tate, who's very explicit about what he thinks life should be like.
Absolutely.
And some people might conflate that with traditionalism, and it's only traditional in the sense that he's sitting there and saying, a woman's place is in a home and she should be making dinner for me and all those types of things. That's where it kind of ends, because really beyond that, he becomes very, very misogynistic. And I don't know if misogyny and traditionalism always have to blend. They don't. But the defined role does. And I do know that for a lot of young men, why they are drawn to somebody like him is because they're living in a world where, for you as a woman, being whatever you want is fantastic. It's great, yes. Right? Like, you can do whatever you want, and you're like, yes, I can be like a man. What's the opposite effect of that? For some people, the identity, they don't know what to grasp onto. They struggle to grasp onto anything. And so when that happens, this is why when you see something that quote unquote is traditional, you can harken back to that. And I think it's why somebody like a Donald Trump, whose slogan is "Make America Great Again," it's hearkening back to a time where those things were just set in stone and you knew how it worked. And if you have been somebody who has struggled in your life to find a sense of purpose and identity, that to you is almost like, oh, somebody gets that I don't know where I fit in. And I don't know if that's, like I said, I don't think that that's entirely healthy, but I do believe that there's a reason why people are drawn towards that. And I think that's part of where the individualism has gotten us, and I think it's why we're kind of swinging back in some ways towards traditionalism.
Oh, yeah. Everything you're saying is resonating on such a deep level. And I think part of what you're talking about is like, if you feel lost, if you don't know where you're supposed to go, what is going to feel like the warm blanket being wrapped around you? Somebody who clearly knows, beyond the shadow of a doubt, what is coming. Somebody who is, even if they're lying through their teeth, saying, this is right, this is wrong, black and white. That is going to feel like the most comfortable thing if you're like kind of floating through life really lost. And the unfortunate reality is a lot of times those people who are saying that, they don't really care that much about the experience of somebody who is lost. They're just trying to like advance their own personal agenda, sometimes at the expense of those people they're most appealing to.
I wonder in my own mind about this, which is that I've always had a very deep sense of my own identity, of who I am, of how I'm supposed to be in the world. That's always been kind of a part of my personality. So I had a sense from very young of the type of person I was going to be, and I was willing to do things that set me apart from the crowd. So I wasn't going to do things just to fit in. I was going to make decisions. So particularly when we were in high school, and a lot of my classmates were going to parties and drinking and doing all those things, I was very much, not for religious reasons, but because I just felt that personally that was not upstanding to who I wanted to be as a human. I sat there and I said no. Now what that meant was I had almost no friends, but I was willing to walk down that road because it meant that I was being true to myself. Now, what I've come to realize is that many people, particularly men, don't have that deep sense of identity ingrained in them. It's not natural to who they are. And so they're often looking for someone who can sit there and say, hey, come this way, do this thing. Now on social media, the algorithms that are going towards those type of people tend to be people with very strong personalities, very strong persuasive arguments that then lead them down this rabbit hole of traditionalism, which can then lead them into places where I think it's maybe negative. It can be looking at, to go back to traditionalism often means marginalizing communities. So it's like you can be traditionalist and you can have these roles, but often in traditional societies, there are people who are marginalized who don't fit in. And I think when the pendulum swung, right, we were swinging towards, hey, these marginalized communities need to be given light. They need to be given air to come up to breathe. And then now that we've done that, those other people on the other side said, well, what about me? Right? They've lost their sense of identity and now they want it back, which is, I think, why we're grasping towards the traditional side of things.
Sure. Yeah, I'm thinking of a million examples of like QAnon just sucking people in because it's a strong sense of identity. It's a strong sense of this is what's right. And here, come follow.
And it's like you said, we hate this thing or we're against this thing. And so we can rally around that.
Exactly. The sort of like, who led us down this road where we are this lost, and let's do something to push them to the outskirts as much as possible. But I'm struck too just by this difference between men versus women. I can remember being in college, I worked as an RA, and we were really taught to pay attention to the men in our hallways if we were working in a hallway with both genders, because they just said, for men, if they aren't joining a fraternity or joining a sports team, their chances of dropping out are like astronomical. Like 80% of men who don't join one of those two kind of kinship groups at a school where you are like a family working together, I mean, you won't make it, you'll leave. And I think you've told your story of like experiencing some of that feeling really lost at school, even with a very strong sense of identity.
Yeah, that was still hard. I had to feel like I had to get out because I couldn't handle it.
Yeah, I mean, you were really willing to forge your own path. And so one of the things I think that regardless of traditional types of expectations placed on people by society that is true is women tend to be very communal or very It's number one, it's more socially acceptable for them to reach out to a support network of people, including women and men. Men, there's much more of the expectation, even like for the Liam Neeson, for the Arnold Schwarzenegger, John Wayne, you figure this out on your own. You don't need anybody. And I think that sadly, even though these sorts of mentalities from Andrew Tate or from lots of different people, they're meant to benefit men, they're meant to give them a sense of self and a sense of identity, and the people that it harms most is actually the very men that it's supposed to benefit, at least from what I see. Because I see just men they're just so angry. They're so angry. And I think what pains me is somebody who I love men, half my friends are men. I had a professor say that once, like, it's hard to watch as people, they're desperate for something to connect them or to ground them, as much as it might seem like men are benefiting from this swing, and they're clearly not doing great at this point. I do worry about just the impact of strong expectations towards independence and what that will mean in an already existing epidemic of loneliness.
Well, I think, and you're pointing out something about what's happening with men right now, which I think is very clear, that men aren't doing well, because right now I think people my age in particular are at some of the highest rates of opioid overdose, and people in my age range and generation are dying younger and younger, because I think that there's a sense of lostness that goes on. So if we're going to talk about kind of the solution to some of this, I do think that having a sense of, I want to say that on some level, the swing towards traditionalism, the longing for identity is not wrong.
No, not at all.
Like, I think that key point is right there. Like, yes, you do need to have a sense of identity if you're going to make it in the world. And I think the same is true for women. The question becomes, what's going to be your model for that? And how are you going to figure out like who you are? But I think becoming part of a group that gives you a sense of you belong, you matter, and if you were gone, people would care that you weren't there. I think those are the three things that you need to have a sense of identity that works in the world. So what you do, and I think this is a wonderful thing about what your job is you create that for people. You give them those three things in ways that other people cannot give them. And I think that that's one of the reasons why something like the church, which has the traditional church, the institutional church, has been dying. It's one of the things that I feel like it's the reason why people feel so lost, is because they're not part of a community that is lifting them up and making them feel like they matter.
Yeah, I love where we're at too, because I think you've really hit the nail on the head, which is this swing toward traditionalism. It comes from people feeling that they don't matter, feeling that they have no identity, and wanting to claim one that is strong, clear, and that has some precedent in our world, because that's safer if we've seen it before. And so, for us as people who are talking about intentional living, I think it's important to encourage people, no matter who they are, no matter where they're at, to really think and get intentional about considering, what is my identity, who I am, and really encouraging people to understand that each of us has the freedom to make choices about what our identity is. Yes, of course, we are put together a certain way, in that we have certain things that are inside of us that we just naturally like. We do have certain specific inclinations as people, and then we have certain societal expectations placed on us as well. But we do each have the freedom to make choices about who we want to be and what values are most important to us. And ideally, our identity and our values should determine how we live our life and how we express who we are and confront any sort of societal change, because we do have a role to play in what society expects from us.
Absolutely. Well, and I would say the way that I would kind of want to close this up is, I think that if you're somebody who's struggling with a sense of identity, or you feel like your life doesn't matter in the way that it should, you need to seek out that community that's going to make you feel a part of something. And that's something that both Rebekah and I have dedicated our lives to, is creating communities where people feel that they can belong. Yeah. So I hope that if that's something you struggle with, that you would search that out to find that. A healthy community, it's very important that it's healthy. But at the same time, I also hope that if you have a community, that you would invest more into it.
Sure.
Because the more you can invest in the community that you have, the more you're going to feel that sense of belonging, purpose, the more you're going to feel like you matter. And I think that's what we all need. And ultimately, I just want you to appreciate that, that's part of what we do here, is we try to build up each other. We try to build up the people who we talk to through this series. And I hope that you would feel a sense of identity and belonging in your life. So I want to wish you well. We'll be back next week for another conversation, and we look forward to seeing you then.